WBZ always has its eye on our changing climate and recently got the chance to visit with a renowned filmmaker in town to talk about his latest project, which focuses on the rapid warming in the Gulf of Maine. Brian Skerry has been diving in the Gulf of Maine for nearly 50 years, and he's frankly shocked by the amount of change that he's witnessed in his lifetime. We spoke in depth about what he's been able to document for the PBS series Sea Change and what he believes are ways we can reverse some of the damage.
So I'm an underwater photographer and documentary filmmaker. I specialize in marine wildlife and been working with National Geographic magazine for 26 years and also more recently doing film. Some of the recent projects that I've done, of course, is Sea Change for PBS and another documentary series called Secrets of the Whales that I did with James Cameron based on the latest and greatest science that shows that whales have culture. So those are two of the more recent television projects.
So what's going on with this most recent one? This is one that's in your backyard because you are a New England guy.
That's right. So, I grew up in Massachusetts, spent 56 years of my life here. I'm now living on the coast of Maine. But I've always wanted to always wanted to explore the Gulf of Maine as a project. I started diving in the Gulf of Maine, which is this body of water from Cape Cod, Massachusetts, up through Nova Scotia, Canada, about 47 years ago when my very first dives were in these waters. And I've always wanted to show people just the beauty, the color, the diversity of life in this place. It's really unique in the world, but I really felt a sense of urgency to do a project about it when this place was identified as one of the epicenters of global ocean climate change. A paper came out a few years ago that said it's warming faster than 97% of the global ocean, and I felt there was a real sense of need to really focus on what climate change means in these waters.
A lot of people don't spend their time by the water. Some people watching this may have never gone to the beach or haven't gone to the ocean in the last 10, 20 years. So they might be asking, why do I care? What do you see in the ocean that's visible change that would matter to somebody?
My answer to that question, Eric, is that even though we are terrestrial creatures and often see our world from a terrestrial-centric viewpoint, we very much live in an ocean world. 98% of Earth's biosphere, 98% of the livable, habitable planet where life can exist on Earth is water, is ocean. Every other breath that we take comes from the sea. Whether you live in Boston or Nebraska or the middle of the Sahara Desert, you are directly connected to the ocean. So even if you don't particularly care about the ocean, it matters to your life if you care about breathing or food that you eat or commerce or any of those things. So I think, for me, my life has been about exploring the ocean and telling stories about it. And right now, what I'm seeing is this existential threat from anthropogenic climate change, that things are changing rapidly in the ocean. And, my job as a journalist, as a storyteller, is to try to give visual context to what that means.
I was going to say, a lot of times you hear about climate stories, you see a blurb on the news and it's, a red map, or maybe it's a line pointing up, and it doesn't necessarily resonate with a lot of people. What do you see in the ocean or on the water that would be a very notable change for anyone, maybe in the last 30, 40 years?
Well, one of the most noticeable changes that I've seen is as temperatures increase in the ocean, we see species either dying or being severely stressed. Another thing that we see, and the reason for that is, oftentimes these are temperate water animals. So in the Gulf of Maine, in our New England waters, these are animals that are adapted to live in cool water. And as those temperatures creep up, there's a limit to what they can endure. So they will either move on or possibly even perish, depending on the species, where they could go, for example. The other thing is that the ocean is the greatest carbon sink on our planet. It takes in more carbon and gives us back oxygen. But we have dumped so much carbon into the atmosphere that the chemistry of the ocean is changing. It is raising in its pH levels. It is becoming more acidic. This is known as ocean acidification. And it's essentially eroding all of these things that live in the ocean. So whether it's a baby lobster, its very delicate carapace, its shell, which can be eroded from ocean acidification, or mollusks or coral reefs or kelp forests, all of these things are suffering because of things like ocean acidification. There's also a real problem with currents being affected. So in the Gulf of Maine, this is a place that was was essentially formed after the last ice age when the Laurentian ice sheets retreated, and it left this perfect recipe. If you were making a cake and you wanted, to make the best cake in the world, you would need all the right ingredients. You'd need to shake it and bake it and do it just right, and that's what the Gulf of Maine is. It led to this proliferation of life because of different sediment bottoms and a rocky coast in some place and a shoaly coast in the Cape Cod, and it also relies on currents. You've got the Gulf Stream coming up from the south, you have the Labrador Current coming from the north, you've got upwellings from the deep ocean trenches where bring all these nutrients, you have a counterclockwise coastal Maine current. So all of those things work very precisely to deliver this life, planktonic life that leads to everything from whales and sharks to lobsters. But those currents are changing because of climate change. As glaciers melt in the Arctic, it's introducing more fresh water. That changes the salinity, the whole dynamics of currents are changing. The Gulf Stream is growing stronger. And essentially this body of water that New England is known for, this Gulf of Maine, is like a giant bathtub that's just getting warmer and warmer because we've turned off the cold water tap.
So you started diving 40 years ago? Around?
47.
47.
Yep,
it's been a minute.
Precise. It has.
And you started around here, and you've had, the availability of time to watch this change. What looks different? You dive in, you put your suit on, you jump into the water, you go to the bottom. What looks different now compared to 47 years ago?
When I started diving 4 decades ago, more than 4 decades ago, I'd go off the beaches of Rockport or Gloucester or Chatham, Cape Cod, all these places in Massachusetts and throughout New England, and I routinely saw great abundance and diversity of marine life. I would see schools of baby pollock and menhaden and all kinds of herring and all this life that I just took for granted. On shipwrecks in Cape Cod Bay or anywhere I was diving, I would see codfish, big cod, and other animals, wolffish and invertebrates, sea stars and metridium anemones, telia anemones, all these beautiful colors, things that you would associate with tropical waters, but they're right here in New England. Today, I see almost none of those things. When I began this project, Sea Change, about the Gulf of Maine, I said, well, I'm going to go back to some of my favorite haunts, the places I know were like a jewelry store, places like Eastport, Maine, where you get a 30-foot tide change and such a rich amount of nutrients. And I wanted to go there and shoot a lot of the coverage, and I went there for multiple trips, and it was like a ghost town. The water was much warmer. There were none of the things I was used to seeing. It was just mud and bad visibility, and all of those things are gone now. So the loss is what I see. It made it very hard to do this series because it's hard to photograph nothing and talk about it. So, you have to find those visual elements that you can actually document climate change with.
Do you think that people sometimes take for granted what things used to be like? Because if you brought your family down to the ocean, you went on vacation, you catch some crabs, you see a little sea life on the ocean, maybe you go fishing, you catch some striper, and you say, there's plenty of life in the ocean. But is it dramatically different if we lived our lives 50, 60 years ago and jumped in? Is it tough for us to gauge that change from year to year?
It is very hard to gauge, and we do move those goalposts continuously. There's a scientist, Dr. Daniel Polly, a marine scientist, who years ago coined the term shifting baselines. And what he meant by shifting baselines is that humans have a tendency to sort of redefine what a natural environment is. If we go into the forest today in our backyard,
that's a normal forest.
That's a normal forest. We see a couple of squirrels and a few blue jays, and that's what it's supposed to be. If you go back 50 years, it looked very different. If you go back 100 years, you go back any number of time, you're going to see much more diversity, much more abundance. That is absolutely true in the ocean. In my cover story in the June issue of National Geographic, I wrote that, if you go back to the time of the Boston Tea Party, when they were climbing up the ships and throwing those barrels of tea into Boston Harbor, there would have been an ocean front row, let's say, the ocean life would have had a front row seat to the Boston Tea Party, but what would have been down there would have been, lobsters the size of a car trunk, codfish bigger than you and me. There would have been pollock, all these trophic layers of animals that would have existed in Boston Harbor, and that's all gone. We are at 1% of colonial levels of codfish. You know, this is a species that the early explorers said were inexhaustible. The guy who gave Cape Cod its name in his logbook, I think, said you couldn't get your oars into the water because the codfish was so thick on the dory. And yet today, we've fished out 99% of them. So that combination of commercial industrialized overfishing and climate change has really collapsed so many of these ecosystems.
How sensitive is the ecosystem to change? Because I feel like a lot of times we talk about temperature and you might talk about a 1.5 degrees Celsius target or a 2-degree target, and that seems so small to most people. Does that small change have an immediate impact?
You know, from my perspective, small changes do have an impact, especially over time. You know, it's like a trim tab on a boat. It may not happen today, it may not happen next week, but over time, those temperature increases are going to pay, you know, negative impact dividends. The other real problem, I think, with changes in the ocean is that the ocean and nature in general, I believe, are very resilient. They know how to take care of themselves. If we just leave them alone, if we had a protected area in the ocean, that's where, you know, I tend to work, if we just made a protected place, it would probably do just fine. It knows how to take care of itself. The problem is that when you have these cumulative effects, it's like the human body. You can fight off an infection if your body is strong. But when it's weakened or compromised because of other factors, it can't fight off those new infections. So as climate change becomes more frequent, or these heating events, as temperatures increase, the ocean has the ability to some extent to deal with that. But if you've compromised those ecosystems through other means, if you've removed the predators, if you've removed the herbivores, if you've moved all these other fish, then it doesn't have the ability to handle those new changes that are occurring.
If people tune in and they watch this Sea Change special, what are some of the stories that you tracked that you think would resonate most with a general viewer, whether they're on the coast or somewhere farther inland?
Well, with Sea Change, we try to do many different things. It's a 3-part series, each 1 hour, and we tried to cover everything from natural history. So in some respects, it was a pure blue chip natural history documentary. It was also a social documentary kind of series where we're looking at people and indigenous cultures and their relationship with the ocean. We're looking at coastal fishing families, how they're enduring and mitigating some of this damage or economic, you know, doom and gloom that might be on the horizon. So I think what you'll see, for me, some of the more visual things are both that people are resilient, like the ocean, that they believe that there's hope, they can adapt to some of these changes. But conversely, you know, we have the scientific community that's showing us that there are some serious problems that we need to be mindful of. You know, we have visuals of seabirds like terns that over more recent years are having problem rearing their chicks because the fish that they normally feed their chicks, like herring or sand lance that a baby tern can easily swallow because they're slender-bodied silver fish, are not present anymore in those warm water summers. So they resort to finding more invasive species or species that become more abundant. They're moving up from the south, like butterfish, which are silver. They look like some of those other species, but they're a wide-bodied fish, and the little chick can't swallow it. So they're either spitting it out or choking, and the mortality rate of those chicks is increasing on those years. We show lobsters underwater. We got some of the very first behavior ever filmed of lobsters digging foxholes or craters in the sea floor. I first observed this a few years ago at the beginning of this project, and I didn't know what I was seeing. I'd never seen that before. Talked to a lobster scientist at the University of New Hampshire, and he said what we're seeing is because seawater temperatures have increased to a point where it's really a sweet spot for reproduction, that there's an abundance of lobsters, and the predators that would normally predate on the baby lobsters, codfish, are pretty much all gone. So now there's been an explosion of lobsters, and there's a housing crisis. The good dens, the rocky, you know, little crevices that the lobsters like to take are already occupied by the ones who got there first, and now the new lobsters have to kind of dig these temporary low-rent condos, I guess, out in the mud. So, you know, there's all of this kind of footage that cumulatively, I think, tells a story of what's happening to this region.
A lot of the times we talk about this is happening, and then it kind of ends there. What do you hope to affect with these types of stories that you're telling? When you see change and people are looking at it and they're saying, okay, that's bad or good, maybe there's more lobsters, they look at it as a good thing. What do I do? What do I take away from it, and do I change anything because of it?
It's a really great question, and my hope with a series like this, or the National Geographic magazine story on the same subject, is really to present the evidence, to show what I've been seeing over the better part of 5 decades. I've seen what I would describe as almost geologic change in my lifetime, and that shouldn't happen. These are stresses that are caused by our actions or inactions, and what I'm hoping is that people come away with a sense of what's going on, and in terms of what we can do about it, well, I would put forth that scientists have been telling us for a very long time that we need to protect 30 to 40% of the ocean, of the dynamic zones of the ocean, to have air to breathe and food to eat and a healthy future. And today, we're only at about maybe 5 or 6%, depending on how you define, protected areas. There isn't a single no-take marine reserve in the entire Gulf of Maine, 36,000 square miles, and there isn't a single one. So I would say that, hopefully people come away with a sense that there are these things occurring, there are solutions to them. We need to have that grassroots sort of movement to have people understand what can be done, and get, our governments to create these places that are protected, which are like investment banks, and will pay dividends for everybody in the time ahead. When that paper came out, Andrew Pershing's paper that said that the Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 97% of the rest of the global ocean, there was a great concern. Everybody, New York Times, everybody covered it, Boston Globe, on lobsters, right? And what does it mean for lobsters? Well, and so I think for those who even know about that, they think, well, the lobsters, as the water warms up, are just going to move up to Canada, right? And there's some truth to that. They're going to go deeper and they're going to go further north. But there's several other things that are impacting lobsters that scientists are studying. They're looking at the ocean acidification, which not only affects the larval lobsters, their shells, but it also impacts their olfactory sense, they think. There was a thing in New England years ago called acid rain, right? And with salmon, they found that as salmon were migrating into rivers, they would get confused, and they ultimately figured out that it was because their olfactories had been eroded because of the acid. The acid rain was impacting them, so they couldn't smell. Well, lobsters, their whole mating and everything is triggered by scent, so that could be a problem. The larval lobsters spend the first 30 days of their life, after the mom releases the little baby lobster, they spend the first 30 days of their life just drifting around in the Gulf of Maine. Those currents are very precise, and then they usually deposit them close to shore in a cobblestone bottom where they have a high chance of recruitment. Well, now those currents are shutting down, and they are being deposited in deep water where they may not recruit at all, so that's a threat. And then there's a mismatch. The thing that baby lobsters like to eat are the same thing that right whales eat, which is a type of zooplankton called copepod, a calinous copepod. Well, now the copepods are showing up in January or February, and the baby lobsters are showing up in May. So they don't get the food, so they're not getting the nutrition. And those copepods are historically comprised of 72% lipids, which make them very nutritious. Well, now, because of climate change, they're being reduced. So even if they do find them, they're not going to get the same amount of nutrition that they would have gotten years past. So, again, that's too much maybe to get into, but those are the kinds of things that I think are really important for people to understand. It's not just that the water's warming, but the currents are changing, the ocean acidification, the mismatch of food, all of those things.
Let's talk a little bit about the positive side of things, because
Sure.
people, they can tune out a little bit when it all sounds like it's bad news. Like, give me some hope. Have there been some solutions, some advances that you have seen that you're happy to see in the last few years?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned, the ocean and nature is resilient and very tolerant of our actions, I think, but we have to take notice and we have to give it a chance. I think, protection, conservation really demonstrates just how a place can thrive. When you protect it, whether it's on land or underwater, you see it all come back. It doesn't always take that long, and there have been examples of that. In the Gulf of Maine, for example, a species of fish known as alewife, a type of herring that was really in rough shape. I mean, there weren't many of those around anymore. And when dams were removed in many of these rivers, they're native ancestral rivers, within a few years, millions of them have returned. They've come back, they've reproduced, and there's lots of them now. And these are baseline sources of protein for so many animals. Things in the ocean feed on them, and then when they swim in the rivers, you got other things that feed on them up in the forest as they're going to the lake to spawn. You know, you got raccoons and bobcats and birds and all these things. So, you know, it works. Conservation is not a theory. We see this. And in the places I've gone around the world, when you protect a marine habitat, all of a sudden you see everything coming back. You know, kelp forests emerge, and fish and sea urchins, and everything is, you know, it's a delicate balance, but they all keep each other in check. And it's fantastic to see. So there are success stories, and it doesn't take much. You know, I've often referred to these protected places in the ocean as investment banks. You know, to not protect it would be like a farmer eating his seed corn. You know, you want to have something for the future, but if you leave it alone, kind of keep your hands off, it pays dividends. You know, those animals don't know where the boundaries are, and they will spill over. I did a story in New Zealand years ago about the value of marine protected areas, and you could mark the boundaries of some of these MPAs, marine protected areas, by lobster traps. You know, you could see the buoys on the surface because the lobstermen knew where they were, and the lobsters don't, and they just spill over and fill their traps. So everybody wins in an equation like that.
His videography is always incredible. He's also done things like Secrets of the Whales, you might have seen streaming somewhere before. Well, if you want to watch Sea Change, it's streaming on PBS, or you can take a look at it on the PBS app. I'm Eric Fisher, WBZ News.